Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talking Images, the officially unofficial podcast of the ICM Forum. Today's episode is going to be about Klaus Kinski. More specifically, Klaus Kinski as seen through his most notable role, Nosferatu. A role that many people don't know he actually reprised. That's right, Klaus Kinski played Nosferatu in two movies. The original Nosferatu by Herzog and a complete and utter disaster called Nosferatu in Venice. We'll start off the episode by simply giving our overall impression of Kinski. We'll talk through this duology, if you will, which really has nothing to do with each other. And then we'll finish off with how these two films, in contrast to each other, perfectly symbolizes Klaus Kinski's journey as an actor and overall career. Joining me today are four wonderful co-hosts: Clement, aka Clementary on the forum, Tom, aka Filmbanta on the forum, Gary, aka Ormast, and finally, and for the very first time, Solomon, aka Saul. So let me just start by asking all of you, what does Klaus Kinski mean to you? And we'll start with Clem.
Kinski is not an actor I'm particularly familiar with. I've seen him obviously in famous roles with Herzog, so Aguirre, Fitzcarraldo, and Nosferatu. He always seems to me like an interesting actor and character. Someone who, well, we appreciate better the less we know of him personally, I think. But he had a very intense way of living in general. And I think you can find this intensity and energy in the part he was playing. He was probably not very versatile actor, I would say, but he definitely made an impression in every part he played. I think he's the type of actors I would definitely see more films with, only because he is in, because I know that no matter what the film, I think he always adds something extra to the movie, no matter how bad it is, as we'll talk about later on.
Excellent. Thank you, Clem. Tom?
So for me, I'd just like to briefly touch upon how I first encountered Klaus Kinski on the screen. And this links in nicely with the first podcast episode where we all discussed our obsession with the IMDb Top 250 and how that shaped our viewing habit. So when I was working on the IMDb Top 250, Aguirre Wrath of God was lurking around near the bottom of the list, and I'd already enjoyed Werner Herzog's documentary Grizzly Man and Rescue Dawn, so I took a punt on the Herzog Kinski box set, which features all the films they made together. And I was instantly enamoured by Kinski's remarkable performances, often in roles as men that are driven to the very brink of their own sanity. He's a larger-than-life, passionate actor with a distinctive appearance. And as Clem said, I think he brings a unique perspective to all of his films that makes them so brilliant to watch, whether it is one where he is at the top of his game, or perhaps one of the lesser works where he's kind of putting in a more questionable performance.
Thank you, Tom. Gary?
Kinski is certainly not what you would consider a conventionally handsome leading man. He's a very odd-looking, in my opinion. His forehead you could sell ad space on. But he is compelling. When he's on the screen, you can't take your eyes off him. He always has also an air of danger, like he's barely in control, and you just don't know what will happen next.
Short and sweet. Thank you, Gary. And finally, Solomon.
Kinski, I've pretty much known as an actor, I guess, for 15 to 20 years. Probably actually first came across him as Nosferatu in the 1970s Herzog film, which I actually watched, I think, within a year or so of seeing the original Myrna silent film. Yes, I was a bit disappointed with that one at the time, so I wanted to see this Herzog one, which everyone was talking about. Although, actually, I think the first film I've seen with him just looked is actually Dr. Zhivago, which I've seen a couple of times. I've just looked at his character in there and I can't call who he was in there, but in general, he's an interesting and very eccentric actor who, much as everybody said, always plays really crazy and sort of like borderline losing his mind characters. And I've actually seen quite a few interesting genre films from him over the years where he plays, eccentric doctors and scientists and stuff like that, which we might be able to get into later.
Something pretty interesting there, Saul, which is that Kinski in quite a few of his films disappear. And it's a really strange thing, because when we think of Kinski, in terms of his overall persona, and we think of his Herzog roles, he is this standout artist that's greater than life. But if you look at his, especially early movies like Dr. Zhivago, like you don't remember who he was in that movie. And before this podcast, I looked up how many films I had seen in which Kinski in some way was associated. And it was about 24. And before this, I thought I'd probably seen 10, maybe less. And it didn't quite make sense to me. So I started looking at these roles. And there's even several roles in famous American films. And he's just not there. Like I think the earliest role I had actually seen him in was Decision Before Dawn, in which his role is whining soldier. Like literally just a whiny soldier on the sidelines. And it's just really interesting that that's where he came from. And that he very slowly, I suppose, then worked up this power, this charisma, this enigma of himself as this grand actor and grand performer.
Just interesting what you mentioned about the early roles like Decision Before Dawn, because I've got that in my IMDb list as something I've seen, but also apparently he was in like Narcissist, or unless I'm looking at the wrong credits, apparently he had a role in that, which is 1947.
It was a dubbing role, so I'm not sure if he dubbed that to German or how that was credited, but yeah, he actually has 3 listings before his actual acting career started as a dubber. Really interesting. I think that Clem and I both watched the documentary My Best Fiend by Werner Herzog, which was done after Kinski's death and seemed to be Herzog trying to make sense of the madness that was his relationship with Kinski, which, as he admits himself, several times led to genuine death threats, a genuine wish on both men's part to murder each other. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting there was that Kinski and Herzog actually lived together before either one in any way became famous. And some of the stories that Herzog tells are simply shocking. It gives a lot of insight into Kinski as a person. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Clem?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree with you. That was an interesting fact. I didn't knew it either before that Kinski and Herzog lived together. That was obviously the first time they met each other. And I remember Herzog saying how much impressed and fascinated he was by Kinski, and how strange and hysterical he could sometimes behave. And if I recall correctly, their next meeting was when Herzog was writing Aguirre and thought of Kinski for the main part, and Kinski calls Herzog at 3 a.m. making some strange noises and grunts and stuff like that. And after half an hour, Herzog finally figures out that it means that Kinski is interested. Overall, I think, Herzog wanted to, as you say, try to look back at his relationship with him. The documentary features obviously a lot of stories about Kinski going mad, but it also features some images and stories about Kinski being, well, nice and caring, I would say, almost, which is something I never thought possible of him, I would have to say. So it was interesting to see that as well. And also how Kinski got into Herzog's mind, and how he mentions that he wanted to murder him, firebomb his house, how he hesitated where the Indians, during the shooting of Fitzcarraldo, when the Indians proposed to him to kill Kinski for him, and he said that he refused, but later on he regretted declining that offer. So yeah, overall it was an interesting documentary, not really trying to figure out how Kinski got this way, but just showing part of his life.
I think 2 of the stories that surprised me the most were the first one, which was that Kinski would practice for hours every single day, mimicking, speaking in very specific ways, in many ways mimicking the actors on screen, so that he could become this great classic German actor, which didn't really happen. And the second one being how in his fits and frenzies would lock himself in the bathroom, essentially break the entire apartment, treat everyone around him terribly, to the point that you would think that this person would be thrown out, be disregarded, be arrested by the police, but it didn't happen because something in him must have had the charisma or the power to make people care for him, respect him enough to support him. That speaks a lot to what kind of strange madness Kinski has. I think 2 other stories as well from Aguirre about how he, at 2 different points, specifically harmed his colleagues. Herzog interviewed one extra who Kinski literally scarred for life. He had taken a machete and hit him in the head, and the only thing that saved the man's life was the helmet, which was broken and put a scar into his face that has never healed. And the second one was when a group of extras were playing cards in a tent, and without any kind of self-control, Kinski shot several bullets into their tent, cutting off the finger of one of them. And he didn't even try not to hit them, he simply shot through the side of the tent. And these are the kinds of acts that could easily have murdered someone, could easily have thrown him in jail. And the strange thing is that this was Kinski and Herzog's very first collaboration. Herzog went from knowing Kinski as a mad roommate that he didn't necessarily have a lot of fond memories of. It didn't seem like they were anyway close back then, to wanting to murder him, to seeing him almost murder extras working on his film, to actually casting him again. And he cast him again 4 times. And the second time was in Nosferatu, the film we are discussing today, and which in some ways seems to be the film which caused the least amount of drama between them, which is interesting. So it's really interesting to just look at his role of Nosferatu. This seemed to be Herzog's, to this point, biggest film. One of the greatest shocks for me was that it was actually shot in English as well. All of the same actors performing the same lines, both in German and in English. It seemed to have a much grander scope, and while it in many ways kept Herzog's style, did seem to try to be slightly more accessible to mainstream audiences as well. And I would like to, starting in the same order as before, with Clem, to Tom, to Gary, to Saul, just talk a little bit about your experiences with Nosferatu and how you felt that Kinski personified the role.
Well, I just remember Kinski in the film. I remember him as being very quiet. Obviously, Dracula is not a very eccentric character that, normally he doesn't run around in the street and stuff like that. So it was strange, let's say, to see Kinski acting this kind of character.
The remake of Nosferatu is obviously a bold move from Herzog and Kinski. The original is such a well-renowned classic of cinema that it's, a brave step to put your own stamp on something that's so well regarded among cinephiles. I don't think that Herzog's vision is perhaps as memorable as the original, but Kinski's appearance in the film is obviously one of their high points. For me, he doesn't cut a more imposing and intimidating figure than Max Schreck did as Nosferatu.
I think to talk about this remake, we first need to talk about how Herzog had such great respect for the 1922 Murnau version of Nosferatu. And plot-wise, he really kept very faithful to the original until the very end, and I won't spoil it for anyone who may not have seen it recently or at all. I rewatched it this week, and it was the first time in about 10 years or so. And some things that struck me about it, the cinematography was just gorgeous. As far as Kinski, his makeup quite mimicked Max Schreck's in the original, but he was much less menacing to me than Schreck. He had a sadness about him. And overall, his acting and the entire state of the film I found very languid and understated. And even the music by Wagner, which we usually think of as being bombastic, in this movie it was just very, very quiet and just flowed along under the acting.
Just going into one of the points there, which is this sadness that Kinski seemed to embody. When you first see him, it's almost as if he has tears in his eyes. You can just feel the pain of his very existence. It's a really strange and surprising portrayal. And it's also strange to see Kinski appear so vulnerable in such an imposing role.
Just from memory, for what Max Schreck did in the original, which was a whole lot of menace, like other people have already said. And it's a very iconic film for the shadow of Nosferatu on the wall, which Murnau did, which is effective and still mimicked by filmmakers these days. But yeah, I think we did see a bit more of something human in the 1979 version by Herzog.
Okay, regarding Herzog remake, I would like to read a part of the Directory of World Cinema book on Germany, which had a review of Herzog's Nosferatu, where it says that Herzog had claimed that the very act of remaking Nosferatu was a way to reclaim the cultural legitimacy for German cinema that he felt had been lost since Hitler's seizure of power in 1933. And it goes on saying that apart from the tribute to Murnau, it also had the music of Wagner, as Gary said, and some landscapes that could remind paintings by Caspar David Friedrich in the scene of Harker's journey to Dracula's castle. So in a way, it was also remaking this film was maybe, but for Herzog, not only a way to just remake simply a film, but also to, as it says, reclaim part of German history that he felt had been lost because of what happened during World War II and the 30s and 40s.
An interesting point as well, because Wagner was, of course, Hitler's very favorite composer. Many people don't know this, but Hitler would every single year go to the Wagner Festival. So it really seems like Herzog in that case might want to reclaim Wagner for Germany as well and cleanse him of Hitler.
This is how I feel as well. I don't really remember Wagner's music on the film, I have to say. But I also, heard that Hitler really liked Wagner. So it was, as I say in the book, probably just a way to just reclaim really big, influential figures of German art history, whether it be music, painting, films, and everything in between. And also the German expressionist movement from the 20s and stuff like that.
I'll just mention I saw an interesting documentary, one called The Architecture of Doom, which was all about Hitler and his obsession with Wagner and music and art and everything. The documentary wasn't entirely convincing with the argument I was putting forward that the Germans just wanted to create like perfect art, which is why they went about all the stuff with the gas chambers and everything. But it was just an interesting film about Hitler and art and Wagner.
And of course, if you want to get a greater sense of Hitler's legacy over Germany in a very iconoclastic way, you should obviously see Herzog's contemporary von Sydow Hitler trilogy, as well as his 5-hour documentary of Winifred Wagner, which really together comment on this legacy of Wagner and Hitler as one, and Germany's history as well. But to lead this back to Nosferatu, I think Gary pointed out a few things that were quite interesting. The first one is that Herzog's movie, especially the first half, is very beautiful. It's very serene. This kind of light, wonderful cinematography, bathed in light. It seems such a departure from the 1922 Nosferatu. It's very interesting to me, at least.
If you want to compare cinematography to the 1922 version, I may have known this already, but I rediscovered it this week. The film producers of the Murnau film were sued by Bram Stoker's estate, and they were told to destroy all copies of the film. One copy apparently had made it to the United States where the copyright had expired. So all copies that we have of that movie have been duped basically off another copy. So that certainly didn't help the cinematography of the original. But a couple things too. Chris and I both remarked on it this week when we were watching. The shots of Kinski with only his head lit were just very striking. And when Harker was trekking his way up to Nosferatu's castle, going along this trail beside the running stream and climbing up the mountain, those scenes were just gorgeous.
I think what made Kinski's portrait similar to Shrek's in a way is that they both presented this more or less unwilling form of doom. They both seem to not necessarily want to do what they were doing, but be drawn by a kind of naturalistic urge. And the way that Kinski in many ways differed here from Shrek is that he genuinely seemed to be sorry for what he was doing. He genuinely seemed to take all of this pain into his heart but really be possessed to do what he was doing anyways. And you can see this throughout the film, including in the final shots, which I don't want to spoil for anyone who hasn't seen Nosferatu yet. There's this extreme sense of, again, melancholy, suffering, despair, and remorse, which I think he really brings to the forefront and portrays so incredibly well.
So I think that I agree on the excellent cinematography, and kind of, to me, adds an almost fairy tale quality to the film, which is perhaps something that you wouldn't have seen in the original. But obviously, as it progresses, as you said, it becomes more melancholic, and the themes of despair and suffering come to the forefront.
And I suppose this in many ways ties us over into the sequel, the unofficial, or shall we say, the officially unofficial sequel, where Kinski does not portray any of this. There is no melancholy, there's no sense of remorse. In fact, it's not even the same Nosferatu. It was intended to be, he was intended to look the same way, but on the very day of arrival at the set, Kinski refused to put on the makeup. He just didn't care. Now that might simply be because he had read the script. He knew that what he was about to partake in was complete and utter rubbish, to put it mildly, but he refused. The only two things that in any way remain the same are the teeth and his fingernails. That's essentially it. The bald, pitiful figure is turned into a long-haired, menacing monster that I would say far more resembles the vision you might have of Mr. Hyde than the pitiful figure of Herzog's Nosferatu. So let's just do a roundtable again and just give some early impressions of Nosferatu in Venice.
As you mentioned, Chris, physically, Kinski doesn't resemble Nosferatu he played in Herzog films. He has long hair, no makeup. Physically, he looks nothing like him. But also, it seems that things that are usually associated with vampires has been totally thrown out this time. He has a reflection. Sunlight doesn't kill him anymore. You can see in some scenes he's just walking around in Venice, just like that. It seems like they wanted to just do a sequel featuring Kinski, but didn't necessarily wanted to make a Dracula film or Nosferatu film, and just took Kinski, who was at the end of his life, so probably didn't care much except for his film Paganini that he really was obsessed with at the time. I think we'll discuss it maybe a bit more later on. But yeah, overall the film it's a fun watch, I'm not gonna lie. It's a complete train wreck. It has no direction. We don't know where the film is going. The story is not really understandable, and you can tell that I think Gary mentioned when we were watching it that you can easily tell the film had like 4 or 5 directors, because all the different way of filming has no correlation or are very different from one another. If I recall correctly, Chris, you said that this is where all the budget went, because because 2 or 3 film directors actually left the shooting without doing any scene, but by taking their full salary, which also probably explains why the film looks so cheap and completely out of budget.
I'm not sure if that's where the entire budget went, but the film was almost over budget before it had started. There were 5 directors involved and 4 of them were just let go because of disagreements with the producer. And also adding slightly to your note about Kinski's Paganini obsession, which is a project that he had been trying to get made for years and had been also trying to push Herzog to direct. The only reason why Kinski ever agreed to participate in this film in the first place was because the producer of Nosferatu in Venice is the producer of Paganini, and Kinski needed to make this film for him in order to get the funding for Paganini.
So I agree with a lot of what Clem and Chris have said. This was a huge step down in terms of quality. Kinski seems absent for most of the film. He's just going through the motions. He doesn't really bring anything to the film. Now, there are a few positives. I still had a good time with it. It's heavy on atmosphere. And I thought there was a great use of the Venice setting. The grandiose, imposing architecture kind of adds to the Gothic ambience. And I also thought that there was a fascinating soundtrack. It veers between playful Ennio Morricone sounding instrumentals to the evocative synthesizer-laden music of Vangelis. These styles don't really work in harmony, kind of jarring, but taken in isolation, they both bring some interesting emotional depth to the table in a film that is kind of devoid of emotion other than the music. One comparison that I would like to make there is I'd kind of view it from my perspective as what I'd call a hot mess, kind of similar to The Exorcist 2. So it's renowned for its kind of muddled attempt at continuation of a well-regarded film, but if you can relish the kind of trashy aspects of the film, you're going to get a lot of enjoyment out of it. And in this respect, at least, I had quite a bit of fun watching it.
This film is similar to the original only because it has the word Nosferatu in the title. It was a terrible piece of garbage. Kinski didn't get the makeup. Honestly, he didn't need it. He looked repellent without any makeup. He was only 62, but a life of hard living really shows on his face. He's still a commanding presence when he is on the screen, but it really seemed like he was just mailing this in for a payday. I didn't count, but I doubt he had more than 10 years of dialogue in the movie. And I just want to tack on to what Clem said about plot-wise, this film had none of the normal tropes that we think of in vampire movies. A cross didn't affect him. He just grabbed one out of a hand and crumpled it up. A stake through the heart doesn't kill him. And for some reason, this vampire only sleeps 24 hours every 24 days. So I gave it a 2 out of 10, and I think that may have been quite generous.
It's really interesting hearing everybody talk about this film because I didn't end up watching it, but I've got it on VHS. It's one of those films I managed to buy when libraries were jobbing out all their VHS tapes when they converted to DVDs. But yeah, just from what everybody's saying, it sounds a lot like Kinski's Fearless Vampire Killers, with all this vampire stuff not working, but obviously it wasn't played as a comedy in the film, so maybe not as interesting as that. Just looking at the cover art or whatever is just interesting. It's got a gigantic picture of Kinski standing there, looking over with protruded teeth. Big letters, it says music by Vangelis, who was obviously, I guess, very big in the 80s after Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire, so that was probably a big sell point. And big picture of Christopher Plummer and Donald Pleasance down the bottom. Yeah, I don't know. It just looks interesting based on the cover art, which is probably why I grabbed it when I saw it for $2 or whatever as ZX rental back in the day. Yeah, even with all these 2 out of 10 ratings or whatever, I'm actually really intrigued to sit down and watch it. I guess maybe next time we have an Italian challenge or something else that comes up on the message boards.
There is something about watching a bad film, especially if it has some kind of, I would say, social narrative attached to anything else. So in this case, the only reason why Nosferatu in Venice is interesting, where all we're talking about, is because it pretends to be a relation of Nosferatu. That's the only reason. Essentially, the entirety of Nosferatu, which was amazing to me, is retconned in this film because there's 1 or 2 lines specifically referring to the plot of the first movie. 1 or 2 lines. And they essentially go like this. I thought he died at this other point in time. And the other person comes back. We don't know. That might just be legend. And with that, everything that happened in the previous film is gone. Nosferatu is in a completely different location. It's a completely different character. He looks completely different as well. And he has a completely new past. None of this has any relation to Herzog Nosferatu's arc, to what the character represents, to anything we have seen before, and it is really just a trashy vampire movie where they at some points try to subvert a few tropes, and it doesn't manage to do any of it. I would also like to jump on the fact that this film, like you said, managed to get 2 relatively big stars. I mean, Christopher Plummer is essentially the lead, or the nice lead, the vampire killer, the replacement of Van Helsing, if you will. and they don't do anything with him. And Donald Pleasence, they don't do anything with him either. It seemed to be there for no real reason. They're not even utilized in the final climax. And I'm not even worried to spoil it because I genuinely do not believe anyone will care.
The way the character of Christopher Plummer ends also is quite unbelievable, so I won't spoil it, but I remember it left us scratching our heads for a few minutes trying to figure out what just happened, which I think is a good summary of the film in general, like why was this a thing, why was this done this way, and why can Nosferatu create hurricanes out of nowhere, and yeah, I don't know. Overall, it's a big question, like why was this a thing?
Let's not spoil the film. Well, I think what's really interesting not even interesting, but it's interesting that they care to do it. Christopher Plummer is brought in as this essentially expert vampire killer. This is how the entire movie opens. We follow his character. He meets the people who are in danger. He's guided through the story. He finds the presumed tomb. He is in many ways our protagonist through the early part of the film. However, as Nosferatu becomes a slightly bigger presence, we get a bit of a callback to the first movie, at least in one way, which is that we open up with one protagonist, which becomes completely diminished as the movie continues. I'm talking, of course, of Bruno Ganz as Parker in the first film. And in this film, that character is Christopher Plummer. But towards the end, Christopher Plummer is completely irrelevant. He has one confrontation with Nosferatu, just one. And like Clem said, we're just sitting there thinking, what? Like, what's going on? Tom, do you want to talk about Kinski's superpowers?
Part of the film that surprised me was when Kinski, as Nosferatu, had the power to completely stop bullets, and there was some very strange effects used that were quite laughable, but I thought were enjoyable at the same time. One aspect that I thought was notable was one brilliant death scene, which I won't spoil for anyone who is going to watch the film, but then it kind of baffled me how a bit later on in the film, the same death scene was recycled, just using a different character. And, you know, for a horror film, you like to see a bit of variety in these kind of scenes. So it just felt a bit of a letdown that they were going with the same idea twice there.
And this film really just is a bit of a slasher, isn't it? It's really just, we have a set of characters we could not care about. They're introduced in the first few scenes, and then they're killed off one by one. And honestly, we don't know them and we don't care. Gary, do you want to wrap it up?
So I think that, just as a bit of a wrap up, I think that it's clear that Herzog and Kinski brought the best out of each other. I think that Aguirre and Fitzcarraldo, along with Nosferatu, are the best work that both of them did. And they had a love-hate relationship as well documented, but I don't think either one would have been as great as they are without the other.
Incredibly true. And I also think that these two roles, in many ways, like we started off, represent Kinski and his career journey and just the type of films he would do. He would do these incredibly powerful films with Herzog, and he would occasionally do a great movie with someone else. What these great movies are may vary, depending on your opinion. But for the most part, he was acting in relatively trashy B-movies. If you look at his filmography at IMDb, there are 137 items there. The majority of those items are what would probably be considered B or C level movies. That is, again, strange for someone who film history remembers so fondly. And just to mirror what Gary said here, I think that's almost exclusively because of his relationship with Herzog and the films they made together. Jump up to Clem, then do Tom and Sol.
Yeah, as you said, Chris, I think it's a good thing we picked these two films, Nosferatu and its sequel, let's say, because, yeah, it really embodies what Kinski was able to do, like act in great films like Nosferatu by Herzog, and at the same time just act in these B or C movies. like Nosferatu, the sequel. I think I read somewhere a quote where Kinski said that he always picked the films that made him the more money in the less time. I don't really know how much he made from all those films, but I think overall he has a very interesting filmography, very surprising one. On the one hand, he acted in films directed by Sergio Leone, Herzog, obviously. He also had a part in Dr. Zhivago. He also played in the Grande Silencio. So he acted in films that were respected. And at the same time, he acted in about 6 or 7 films, I think, by Jesus Franco. He acted in this Nosferatu the sequel. He also made a lot of B-movie Western type of things. So I think it's a very interesting filmography, and you don't really know what to expect from him, let's say. You don't really know where he's going next and the type of film he'll be acting on later on. And I think for those who like B-movie type of films, I'm sure he has a filmography that is very much worth exploring.
As Chris and Clem have both mentioned, I think that the 2 Nosferatu films that Kinski appeared in do offer a great reflection of his career legacy. He veers from unforgettable performances in definitive films that are widely regarded amongst some of the all-time greats to forgettable fare where potentially he could just be appearing for a paycheck. I'd like to make a loose comparison to an actor who's currently working today. Both of these actors featured in successful remakes with Werner Herzog. So, of course, we've got Klaus Kinski, who appeared in Nosferatu. But we also have Nicolas Cage, who appeared in Herzog's version of Bad Lieutenant. Now, for me, both of these actors appear in some excellent films where they're at the top of the game, but there doesn't seem to be any middle ground. They're either at the top of the game or they're kind of stumbling through, just going for a paycheck. And for me, Klaus Kinski is one of the all-time great actors. Whether he's in a film where he's putting forward a great performance or a bad performance, I just find him watchable. There's something that he brings to all the films that makes them really entertaining.
It's an interesting discussion. It's interesting hearing everybody talk about Kinski. There's obviously a lot of disparaging of a lot of the films that he did towards the end of his career. But as a genre fan, I'm really into, sci-fi, horror, fantasy films. He's made quite a few interesting ones like late in his career. So I'm just thinking about things like a movie called Raw Space, which is sort of like a update of sort of like Mr. Brooks. Kevin Costner was sort of like an update and like a doctor likes committing murders, which isn't really a great film, but he's quite decent in that. He's also did some interesting stuff in the 70s, a film called Lifespan, which I watched for the Dutch Challenge last year, which is actually, again, really interesting, playing a science or doctor character. It was in Billy Wilder's last film, Buddy Buddy, playing a sex doctor, and it's a bit crazy and eccentric as he usually is. So, I don't know, I think I've really enjoyed, the majority of his work in B and C grade films towards the end. But of course, also the stuff in the beginning, the westerns, like, The Grand Silence, excellent in that. Also, I recently saw The Ruthless Four, about gold prospectors trying to get gold, and none of them can trust each other because they're going to steal each other's gold, but then you'd have somebody else to help them carry the gold back. So it was a really interesting film and a really interesting performance. I've always found him quite interesting and entertaining to watch, even with some of the lesser films towards the end of his career.
I would also really like to shout out A Bullet for the General by a director called Damiani, which is probably one of the more interesting spaghetti westerns as well. And Kinski did so many of them. Some of them fantastic, like The Great Silence, and some of them just not that interesting. And again, that ties back into the type of roles Kinski would do. He would get a quick paycheck, he would be in essentially anything that was offered to him, and that's how he spent his life. However, and I think we've all been referencing this throughout, at the very end of his life, or even in the last decade, he became obsessed with the historical character of Paganini. He had written the script himself. He had begged Herzog consistently to direct it, but Herzog found it unfilmable. I think it's worth noting that the last collaboration with Herzog, Cobra Verde, was shot the very same year as Nosferatu in Venice. And in both of these cases, Kinski's mind was on the role of Paganini. What Herzog said in My Best Fiend was that at the very last day of the Cobra Verde shot, Kinski already was Paganini, a role he would not be able to quite realize for another 2 years, and a film, the first one he directed himself, which has essentially become completely forgotten, completely ignored, and by most of the people who do end up seeing it, dismissed as softcore porn. And that was also the second last film Kinski ever made. He died just a few years later. And I think this sums up a very strange life, an interesting career, in which you see his deterioration from an actually quite good-looking, though slightly odd-looking bit actor to a monster. Like Gary said previously, Kinski did not need any makeup for Nosferatu in Venice. He already looked disturbing. He already looked menacing. He was in many ways Nosferatu. Or this more sinister, disturbed, and not very good Nosferatu. Any final remarks?
Might just have a bit of a shout out to a movie called Operation Thunderbolt that Kinski did in the 70s, which is again an interesting film. He's sort of like eating all these terrorists. Another film to put out there that is his varied output as an actor.
Very good, everyone. Thank you all for joining in. And to all our listeners, you have been listening to Talking Images, the officially unofficial podcast of the ICM Forum. Thank you for listening and join us again soon.